both of us grew up in Bombay, a few blocks from each other, except
that I'm really old.
Well,
And you're so young.
to say, but and then you've lived in London, and now you've been living in New York since 2000.
99.
But you've been going back to Bombay quite often in the last few years. So, do you miss Bombay?
What I miss is a city that's not there anymore. You know, that's to say, it's changed enormously.
The city underneath Mumbai.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, your book, Maximum City, is about what's happened to the city, and Midnight Children is about a city that doesn't exist. It's a city that used to exist.
Do you feel you could write about the present city, about Mumbai?
Well, I tried a little bit. I mean, the Moors Last Sigh, in a way, I thought that about it. I thought that the Moors Last Sigh was an attempt to write about what happened, to write about Mumbai, to write about the Shiv Sena and, you know, religious extremism arriving in a city which had prided itself on not being extremist in that way. The transformation of the city from one size to a much larger size, and from, if you like, a kind of English medium city to a Marathi language city. I tried to write about that in that book. That was the first attempt, anyway. I don't know, I think if I was going to write, I think I'd have to do what you did. I think I'd have to go back there for a long period of time. I mean, I go back, as you know, I go back all the time, every year, I hope, and sometimes more than once a year. But I think to write another big Bombay novel, you know, I'd have to go live there.
When I go back to Bombay, I often try to see it through my children's eyes, and you did the same last year. You took your two sons there. What were their observations of the city, and did you take them to the parts of the city where you grew up?
Well, they wanted the Salman tour, you know, and it was interesting to me how much it mattered to them. You know, I mean, that's the house where I grew up. That's where I went to school. This used to be my playground, to quote Madonna. But actually, there was a place that used to be my playground. And it really mattered to them. You know, and I have two sons of very different ages. I have one who is 13 and one who is 31. But actually, the 31-year-old was just as affected as the 13-year-old, and that, it was surprising. So, anyway, so yes, and they kind of got it. That was what I liked. You know, they really got the thing about Bombay that is wonderful. You know, underneath all the crap.
What is it?
Well, what did you say? You say it.
Well, I've been trying to think about this because I'm writing a book about New York now, and immigrant New York. And these are the two cities in the world where I, as the jacket bios say, I divide my time, although I think I multiply my time between Bombay and New York. And I've lived in Paris and I've lived in London, but it seems to me that these two cities in particular have something...
Well, they're like each other.
Yeah.
They're quite like each other.
Yeah, they're brother cities.
Even physically, you know, Manhattan Island and South Bombay, the peninsula that the British made by joining up the Seven Isles, they're the same size, for a start. They're just about the same length and the same breadth, and they're both high-rise cities, and they're incredibly intense. And, you know, they're clearly kindred.
And they have a connection to Catherine of Braganza.
Catherine of Braganza, which is a wonderful story. You want to tell it, shall I tell it?
Well, we can both.
You start.
So, the city of Bombay was given as part of the dowry for Catherine of Braganza, the Portuguese queen, and
she married Charles II of England, the second half of the 17th century.
Right. And then you can talk about the queen's connection.
Well, the thing about Catherine of Braganza is that she was famously ugly. And as a result, the dowry had to be pretty fantastic. and the devious British knew this. And so they persuaded Charles II, who was, of all the kings, the king of the Restoration, you know, king who loved beautiful girls. Nell Gwynn, famous orange seller, became his mistress. And he's obliged to marry this less beautiful individual because the British sort of diplomat said we could get them to give us Bombay Harbour as the dowry. And so the British got Bombay Harbour from the Portuguese because of the marriage of Catherine de Braganza. They immediately put the navy there at a fort, and the British Empire followed. So the ugliness of Catherine de Braganza is the thing to which we owe the British Empire. And then meanwhile, during the reign of King Charles II, here they were laying out what were then these two areas for settlement, what were called at that time the Kingsborough and the Queensborough. And the Kingsborough became Brooklyn and the Queensborough became Queens. So Catherine de Braganza is the queen, after whom Queens is named, as well as the queen who brought Bombay to the British. So we share this ugly lady. And then you heard the story about the statue. They were going to build a statue. They were going to build a commemorative statue to Catherine de Braganza and put it up in Queens. They were going to put it on the seaside so she could look out at liberty. She was going to be big, right? There were going to be these two big women looking at each other. and they chose a woman sculptor, American sculptor, who decided, perhaps because she looked at some pictures of Catherine de Braganza, that she wasn't going to do a likeness exactly. She was going to do a multicultural tribute figure. And so she designed this figure, which was actually much uglier than Catherine de Braganza, which had like African American lips and Chinese eyes and etc. It was an abomination. Anyway, but then somebody in Queens discovered that Catherine de Braganza, as a member of the Portuguese ruling family, the Braganza dynasty, was implicated in the slave trade. And they said, how is it possible that we can put up a statue facing the Statue of Liberty of somebody who is involved in the slave trade? This ignores a couple of things. First of all, she wasn't a slaver. I mean, it's true that the Crown of Portugal was involved in the slave trade. She's not, doesn't seem to have ever been involved in it herself. And besides, there are presidents of the United States who had slaves. Yes. And nobody talks about whether there should be a memorial to Jefferson, But anyway, they won. They won the argument. And as a result, she was not built. The statue was never built. And there we are.
Except there's a giant statue of the warrior king Shivaji coming up in the Bombay Harbour, which is going to be taller than the Statue of Liberty. And there's an enormous amount of money which will be spent in building the statue, which will presumably guard Bombay against Portuguese invaders.
There used to be an equestrian statue of Shivaji, which was a perfectly ordinary size statue, but obviously not big enough. Shivaji, it'll be hideous, of course, because it's being built by the Shiv Sena and anyway, Hindu fundamentalist party, which uses Shivaji as its kind of icon.
But there's something in common about these two cities, that both of them see themselves as city-states. There's something not exactly American about New York, as there is something not exactly Indian about Bombay. There's a kind of
but don't you think that's true? That's
identity.
True of all of the great metropolis. Anyway, Paris is not France, London is not England, New York is not America. I think that's it's something that happens with the great metropolis, is that it becomes somehow different than the country that it's in, and I don't think that's unique. That's something I think that many of the world's great metropolises could say. But what I think is true about them is the magnet thing, the way in which everybody comes. New York clearly is an enormous, like the great attractor. People come swarming here from all over.
It's going from 8 to 9 million over the next 20 years. And Bombay adds 1 million new people every year.
Yeah, every week. And that's just the ones they count.
Yes.
Because there's plenty that aren't counted who slip through the cracks. But it's just physically where Bombay is situated on the west coast, basically halfway up the country. Everything north of Bombay is North India. Everything south of Bombay is South India. And so you get every kind of Indian migrating to that city in search of work. So the people you see in the streets of the city are everyone. And I think that's similar to New York. That's similar to New York. This extra dimension of heterogeneity. makes it very exciting.
Well, in that way, well, as you point out, many of these great cities are similar, and London certainly is very multicultural, and Toronto is even more diverse than New York. I believe 45% of Toronto is foreign-born, and in New York it's about a third. Although 2 out of 3 New Yorkers are immigrants or their children. So it's
and also the immigration to New York is also an internal immigration from other parts of America. So. And I sometimes think that to come from, Pocatello, Idaho, to New York is a longer journey than to come from Bombay.
Right.
Because I think if you have grown up and lived in a great city, you know what it is. If you're a city person, you know how to live in a city.
I met the guy who came in from Pocatello and gave him directions.
Yeah, exactly. So I sometimes think that those of us who have moved between cities have not made such a long journey, but to make a journey from a small village in the middle of the countryside to the big city, that's a bigger journey, it seems to me.
There seems to be a global rush from the countryside to the cities. So more human beings live in cities than in villages for the first time in human history.
Bad for the Republican Party. That's why the Democrats won Virginia. Exactly that. And I think it's one of the reasons they're scared. It's because they see the demographics of the country changing as it urbanizes. And urbanizing tends to increase liberal ideas and diminish Republican votes.
This is true all over the world, do you think?
I think, well, I don't know, because one of the things I remember in India, when I was younger, I went on a lot of, actually when I was thinking about writing Midnight Children, I went on a lot of very, very long bus journeys around India, like 24-hour bus journeys with chickens vomiting on your feet. I mean, I'm not kidding. Chickens vomiting on your feet. That's not magic realism. I mean, I wish. And what you saw was when you were in the deep, deep rural areas, the buses were completely unsegregated. Men and women sitting side by side. You look out in the field, you see men and women working side by side. When survival is such an issue, you cannot push women out of the workplace, and you have to treat them as equals because you need them as people in the labor force. As you would come into the edges of the city, you would see that change. You would suddenly see the women sitting at the front of the bus, the men sitting at the back of the bus. And that kind of segregation and sequestering of women seemed to me like a petit bourgeois disease. It was like being able to say, I can keep my women folk at home, I don't need them to work. And it was very clear to me that in many ways the city was less liberal, less liberal than the countryside in India. Here I think it is different. Here I think the cities are more liberal.